Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Road to 2000. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will be your driver on this journey. I hope you all had a great Memorial Day weekend, because I had an especially great Memorial Day weekend. As you have probably already read in the title, I actually took first place in my section at the Chicago Open this year. I was in the under 2300, just barely snuck in there with my 2200 rating. And won all my games, believe it or not. I took a half-point bye in the first round and went 6-0 for the remainder of the tournament. So tonight I wanted to take you through some of my games, show you how it all went down, what it takes to win the under 2300 section at the Chicago Open. Not the Open section. I think there was some confusion in the chat. I'm not that good, I promise. The winner of the Open section this year was actually St. Louis local Darius Swiertz. So good day to be from St. Louis. Without further ado though, let's jump into the games here. And I want to show you first my round one game against Evan Huang. So Evan had the black pieces in this game, and I didn't really do any prep going in. I just, my philosophy for tournaments is pretty much always just play what you're used to, and play what you know. Don't do anything too crazy because you'll find yourself losing a lot of time in the opening. If you're less familiar with it, you have to think a lot more, and it can end up backfiring. But let's jump into how this game went against Evan. So I play my normal d4. Evan ended up doing knight f6. I go c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, and e4. So we're in the King's Indian defense. Evan goes d6, bishop e2, castles, and now I play knight f3. So with this move, I am entering just the classical orthodox variation of the King's Indian defense. So what that means is black now has really about 5 different options for how he wants the game to go. By far the most popular is playing e5 here, challenging the center directly, and we'll see how the game can continue after that. But black does actually have a few other options here. You can play bishop g4, you can develop this knight first, you can even go for an early c5, but by far the most popular is e5, and that's what my opponent plays in this game. I end up castling, and now my opponent can choose between knight c6, knight a6, knight d7, or even takes on d4, just all different lines to choose from. But my opponent, again, picks the main line with knight c6. So now, after the game, I had a quick chat with my opponent, and apparently this is one of his first ever games in the classical King's Indian. He doesn't normally play this line, but he wanted to try out something new for this game. So that turns out to have been not such a great idea for my opponent, and I'll explain why in a little bit. I go d5, my opponent plays knight e7, I go knight e1, my opponent plays knight d7, all the normal moves. I go bishop e3, and then these strange knight moves make a lot more sense when you realize black's plan is to play f5, expand on the king's side, and try to checkmate white. In the meantime, white's plan is to expand on the queen's side with moves like b4 and c5, and try to open things up on this side of the board before black ends up checkmating. So black's mysterious knight move is to play f5, white's strange knight move is to play f3, supporting the center and giving this bishop a place to hide when f4 does come on the board. So I come back to f2, and black plays g5. And now I kind of zoomed through all of those opening moves. We're on move 13 now. And the reason why I went so quickly is this is by far, well, not super by far, but this is one of the main lines of the King's Indian defense, and it's pretty linear. There's not much variation in these lines. This is generally always how these games go in this variation. So up to this point, that means that both myself and my opponent were playing very quickly, just blitzing out the moves, because we had both had this line memorized. And that's perfectly fine, but then I think the mistake my opponent runs into here is he kept matching my pace, when in reality, I knew a few more moves in this line, but I don't think my opponent actually quite had it memorized. He was just sort of following my pace and matching the flow of the game. And that's actually a huge psychological over-the-board trick that you can make use of. there's sort of different schools of thought on what you should do when you know the opening really well. Should you just blitz it out, or should you maybe, I don't know, like feign like you're thinking, like you're not sure what to do? And I definitely think it's in your best interest to blitz it out. If you are absolutely certain about the opening theory, you have it all memorized, you feel very, very comfortable, then I really do like blitzing it out. Because more often than not, your opponents tend to match your pace, match your energy. And that's what happened here, I think. So the line that I play in this case is with rook c1. And that is technically the most popular move. But knight d3, b4, a4, even g4, and knight b5, these are all other moves in this variation. So this is really the first massive branch to know if you're going to play the King's Indian. Now, do you have to memorize a line against each of these moves? Probably not, but you should at least be aware that all of these moves exist. So what this means is, this is generally when players should start to slow down with the black pieces. There's like 7 different moves here. There's no way you have everything memorized. And so it makes sense to slow down a little bit. Make sure you're playing the absolute best moves. And if you don't do that, then what happens in the game might happen to you. So I play rook c1 pretty much immediately because I know it's the line that I play. It's the best move in my opinion. And then my opponent blitzes out h5, which is actually not so strong. It's still a playable move. It's been played at high levels before, but it doesn't make the most sense with black's plan. So who in the chat knows why h5 is just a little bit suspect? Why is h5 a little bit wrong? It's a pretty deep idea, and if you're not very, very familiar with the opening, it's not going to be easy to understand why this move is a little bit incorrect. So what do you think, chats? King Zlatan says h5 is bad. I kind of agree. I don't think it's as awful as you might expect, but I don't think it's very good. And JF says it exposes the king, so that's actually not it. I'll be impressed if anyone in the chat can give me the reason I'm thinking of here. So h5 continued to weaken the king side, so that's not really going to be it at all. h5 is entirely thematic with black's plan. Black wants to play h5, g4, g3, and checkmate the white king. And h5 is definitely helpful for that plan. As black in this variation, you have so much space on the king side that you really are just pushing h5, g4 in many, many games and winning the game on this side of the board. In this case, though, there are slightly more useful moves black could be playing, and we're going to see that impact as a result of the next move that gets played. So knight g6 is a much better move for black, or rook f7. Alternatively, rook f6 is like super different. Rook f6 is the line that black plays when black wants to play for checkmate immediately. But knight g6 and rook f7, I think, are both pretty similar moves, and they both have the same idea. What idea is that? Well, the idea is, with rook c1, white has very much telegraphed the plan. White wants to play c5, take, go knight b5, and start to gang up on the c7 pawn or the c7 square. So with knight g6, what black is doing is essentially preparing for this idea by getting ready to bring the rook up to f7, where it can both defend the 7th rank and prepare to swing over to the g file to help influence the attack. Now, this is a very nuanced idea as to why h7, h5 shouldn't be played just yet, but it is, not irrelevant, right? Every tempo matters in the King's Indian. And already getting my opponent to blitz out a move like h5, I think, is a pretty big concession by black. So these rook f7, knight g6 moves, I think, are a bit better than h5. It's not like black is losing yet, but again, a little bit of a concession there. So how should I respond to h5, knowing that it's a little bit of a mistake? How should I respond? And yeah, King Zlatan has the right idea. We just go c5 anyways. And as the king is saying in the chat, you get a slightly improved version because black just isn't quite ready with these defensive or offensive ideas with the pieces coming over to the king's side. So I played c5 pretty quickly. I was reasonably comfortable, and knew that this was the correct move, more or less. And then my opponent immediately blitzes out knight f6. And this move is just awful. This move is just very, very bad. So am I saying you should never try new openings that you aren't fully comfortable with in tournaments? Not necessarily. If you're not expecting to like win the tournament or anything and you want to get more comfortable with new openings, trying them out can be a great thing to do. Just know that you're taking a pretty substantial risk. Also, when you do try out a new opening, it is very, very important not to do what Evan did here, which is just blitz out moves, assuming you know what's going on, even if you actually aren't entirely sure, because there's no bluffing in chess. Okay, maybe there's some bluffing in chess, but bluffs rarely work in chess. So pretending you know what's going on isn't the same thing as knowing what's going on. And in this case, knight f6 is actually just a losing move. It's like +2 already for white. You simply take on d6, continue with knight b5, just the thematic idea. And then knight c7 is very difficult to stop. In fact, the only move that stops it is knight back to e8. And this move is bad for obvious reasons, being you move the knight many, many times. But the easiest comparison I can make is rather than play knight d7 to f6 to knight e8, black alternatively sometimes just plays knight e8 in one move. So black is essentially down 2 tempi on an actual line here, and that's just very, very bad. In the game, what my opponent did was even worse. At this point, he did take a little bit of time, but he very confidently played the move knight g6, and this is just giving up on the game, unfortunately. And after knight c7, this rook is essentially dead. If you play rook b8, bishop a7, and this rook is entirely trapped. No place for this rook to go. So my opponent plays g4, I take the rook, he plays g3, and for the rest of the game he tried some kind of attack on the king's side, but it's just not meant to be. I just take the free pawn, drop my bishop back, bishop h6, rook c2, knight h5, and then it's a little bit of a moot point because pretty much everything is winning here for white, but I'd like you guys to come up with a nice defensive resource in this position. I'm happy with the move that I found. I think it really just ends the game on the spot, more or less. So white to move and secure the victory. Obviously, we're up a rook, so there's more than one way to go about it, but believe me when I say that I have lost better positions in the King's Indian. Not over the board, but definitely online. I've lost positions, up more material for less of an attack. So what can we do here to completely nullify this kingside attack? Someone in the chat is asking my favorite question. Caleb Denby won the Chicago Open? Yes! Not the open section, but the under 2300 section. I did win. It's my new favorite question. I walk around waiting for people to ask me how my weekend was, and then I tell them. So Deepin says G3. Deepin says G3. So not quite the right idea there, but I like where your head's at. Do I like where your head's at? How did you come up with G3? G3 is just not good. You lose a pawn, you get checkmated. But the correct move is, in fact, a pawn break in the form of f4. Now, what makes f4 different than G3? Well, the point is that now all of our pieces have access to the king's side, and it's going to be very, very easy to defend the king now that our pieces can get in. Conversely, let's say I had played some move, like capturing this free pawn. All of a sudden, things can get a little bit tricky on the king's side. For example, knight g to f4. Let's say I just save this piece or something. You know, it's not a lot, but you can tell how, a mistake might be made. Like, let's say, obviously, like a piece is hanging, but let's say in some position I played like king h1. This is already going to be, like, at worst, a draw for black with stuff like this coming in. And some kind of attack on the king, right? So it's clear that while I am entirely winning, it's not completely without risk. Like, it's pretty good for white. It's honestly almost entirely without risk, but f4 is a nice move just to lock everything down and make sure that this attack never gets off the ground. My opponent actually blunders again here with knight g3. I think you have to try taking this pawn, although it's not going to get you very far. But he played knight g3, and now bishop g4 is simply a winning idea. This bishop is essentially trapped on c8. My opponent tried taking f4, but now I simply take g3, take c8, take f8, play bishop h3, and my opponent resigned, I think, after playing the move king e7. So that was round one. Not such a difficult game for me because I had a lot more opening knowledge than my opponent. But the big takeaway here is actually from my opponent's play. Like, it's great to know your opening. You know, if you get lucky, you know the opening a lot better than your opponent, and you get an easy game like this. But the takeaway is that when you don't know the opening, you should be spending your time. Just because you are in the opening stage doesn't mean you can't make game-ending mistakes. And that's what happened here. Evan, unfortunately, kind of lost this game before he ever started playing it. Just because, you know, he didn't think. Like, if he had thought and still missed these ideas, then that would be one thing. But he never even really gave himself the chance. So that's the lesson to take away from this one. All right, up next, I want to take you to round two against Benjamin Tang. So, let me tell you about Benjamin Tang. Now, I had one thing that I wanted going into this tournament, and that was to not play any children. Because most of you probably know we've had a bit of a global pandemic going on for the past little while now. And that means there's all these kids who haven't played chess for a year, and their brains have just been sitting in their head, growing, developing, and they're horribly, horribly underrated. So, of course, in round two, they pair me with a 10-year-old. So here I am against 10-year-old Benjamin Tang. Now, Benjamin, I think, is rated about 1950 USCF, but unfortunately for me, he's rated about 1400 FIDE. So I had a lot to lose in this game against Benjamin Tang, and this actually ended up being one of the most difficult games of the tournament. So remember the name Benjamin Tang, because I think in a few years you're going to see him at events like the US Juniors. I would be surprised if you didn't. But okay, Benjamin plays e4. We get the Caro-Kann. He goes knight d2. I take the main variation, and I go bishop f5. I'm not one of these crazy knight f6 guys. I just go bishop f5. And then my opponent stuns me with the move knight to c5. So many of you might not be as familiar with this variation. It's very much a sideline, and black is thought to be able to equalize really in any number of ways. b6 is a very common idea, just to kick the knight away. Knight d7 is also very common. I play the third most popular move, which is e5. Now, let me tell you a quick aside here. My opponent in the game started to reach for his d4 pawn, which was very strange to me. I think he thought that my e5 pawn was hanging, and he was going to like capture it. Obviously, this hangs a piece, so that wouldn't be so good. But as he neared his d pawn, he violently threw his hand away and then shook his head. So I guess he recovered from almost blundering a piece in the opening. And I really wish he would have blundered that piece, because this game ended up being quite difficult. Instead, he found the correct move, knight takes b7. I think he actually knew the correct move, just had sort of a moment. And you know, he's 10 years old. I guess he's allowed to have some moments. I went queen b6, goes back to c5. The knight is trapped otherwise. That's the point of my opening so far. And this move is thought to be pretty good for white, but I choose this move instead. Just e takes d4, pressuring this knight again, so there's no time to take on d4. White jumps back to b3. And now bishop b4 check is a very common idea, but I actually just played c5 directly in this game. The idea of bishop b4 check, generally after bishop d2, is you play c5 eventually anyways. Maybe knight f6 first, but c5 is still coming. But I just went c5 immediately. My opponent chose bishop d3, which is the main move. I take, and my opponent plays queen takes. Again, very quickly. So I believe queen takes is actually a little bit of a positional, I wouldn't go as far as to say mistake, but definitely a positional misunderstanding. So believe it or not here, I believe c takes is actually going to be a much better move, much more testing move for white. And the reason for that is entirely structural. So with queen d3, it's true that you activate the queen, and you still have good control over the light squares, but with c takes d3, you are giving yourself this nice target to look at on the c5 square, and you are even further strengthening your control over the c4 square. So I think c takes might have been good. Yet another reason why you should slow down in the opening. Just because it's the opening doesn't mean you're not making important decisions. So queen takes d3 played instead. I go knight f6, and we develop our pieces and castle our kings like true professionals. And then my opponent plays knight bd2, just heading for c4, and this is a perfectly reasonable idea. I continue developing. We see knight c4 and drop the queen back to c7. And my opponent plays this move a3. So unfortunately, I've put myself in a very awkward situation here. And that situation is the position is more or less entirely equal, but my opponent is 700 points lower rated than me according to FIDE, and unfortunately, he's probably not that much weaker than me in actual playing strength. So I had to find some way to have something to play for here. So I can't just put all my rooks on the e file, trade all the pieces, and agree to a draw, because I'm going to lose infinite rating points. So what should we do to try and find something to play for in this position as black? How can we do it? Do I always play the Caro-Kann? These days, pretty much yes. Way back in the day, I used to play the Petrov, but that doesn't happen as often, or really at all these days. And yet Jonathan Schrantz making an appearance in the chat. YouTube celebrity Jonathan Schrantz popping in to say wow at my big victory. Appreciate it. So just a spoiler to anyone in the chat room thinking about using an engine for this one. All of the moves you're thinking of are fine. They're pretty much all equivalent. This is one of those positions where you can play pretty much anything and you're not going to impact the evaluation of the position too much. But I just want to see if the chat can come up with any long-term ideas. Hello, Free the Robots. Hello, hello. So I like what Mike is saying, as well as King Zlatan. So definitely what we need to do is somehow pressure these queenside pawns, right? We're not going to make any inroads on the entirely symmetrical king side. We're not really going to be able to invade on the e file. Our opponent has just as much control over that file as we do. So we need some way in the long run to make something happen on the queen side. This was my thinking as well. So as far as actual ways to make that happen, well, of course, this knight has to go, because this knight is single-handedly defending pretty much every square on the king side that matters. And I thought that maybe I shouldn't allow white to get this set up with b3 and a4. I thought that would be a little bit too solid. So King Zlatan mentioned knight d7 to b6 as an idea to try to remove this knight. Fortunately, I think that's going to be a little bit slow, and in the long run, white's going to be able to plant this other knight onto c4 as well. So I didn't see any immediate way to really shake these pieces loose, but I thought in the long run, it might be nice to have my pawn up here on a4, so that any eventual endgames, or even in the middle games, b3 is going to be a lot less easy to play for white. And if I ever get this pawn down the board, then I'm doing a nice job of ganging up on b2 here. So I play the move a5, and I think this move is fine. Any other move you guys were suggesting, also perfectly fine. Put the rook on the e file, put the knight on d5, play h6, put the rook on the b file. Okay, oh. I inspected the element on Google Chrome. Should never do that. Putting the rook on the b file, also fine. All these moves, totally fine. But I think that black should definitely be focused on playing against the queenside pawns, so that's how I came up with the move a5. My opponent plays this move rook e1, taking control of the file. Now, just because I'm playing for the queenside, it doesn't mean I want to completely abandon the e file, so I did play rook e8, just matching my opponent on this file. My opponent develops with bishop g5, and here you could argue that I should have kept the tension on the king side a little bit more, maybe take this opportunity to play a4, but I just played the move knight d5, simplifying some things. We get bishop takes e7, and rather than take with the rook, I actually chose to take with the knight here. The idea being, again, I just want to keep some pieces on the board, and maybe this knight can reroute to do some nasty things on the king side. My opponent plays rook e5, and I have a question for you, chat room. Do you have a tactic with knight f4? Is knight f4 a good move here? And what do you think white would play in response? So these are the types of questions that you have to ask yourself during an actual game. It's one thing to spot a move in a tactics puzzle. It's another thing to spot a move and try to determine for yourself if it's actually worth playing. Two different things entirely. So given white's last move, what do we think white's plan is against knight f4? So yeah, King Zlatan again has the right idea. Knight f4, I'm pretty confident that white was banking on this move, queen e4, getting ready to double on the e-file, potentially triple on the e-file. How to continue? Knight f4 loses to queen d2. I'm not so sure it loses. It's pretty difficult to play a losing move in this position, actually. There's a lot of moves you can play that don't lose. Can you explain why knight f4 would be a tactic in the first place? So when I say tactic, what I really mean is a set of forcing moves, right? It might not necessarily win material immediately. It might give you some small positional gain, maybe. But it's a set of forcing moves. It's something you can calculate. So not necessarily a tactic, but forcing moves. Yeah, so this is the idea I was kicking around in my head. If you play knight f4 and your opponent goes queen e4, now all of a sudden you can go knight g6. And this is the series of forcing moves I was looking at to try and calculate. Because now this rook has to go over here. And if the rook has to go over here, you're not a very happy camper. Because all of a sudden you're losing control over the e-file. Your queen's opposite this rook. You don't really have any kind of winning attack. And black might be taking over the game. So at first blush, it looks like knight f4 might just be a great idea. But in the end, I decided not to play it. And part of the reason why was because of this knight d2 idea, maybe even queen f1, or even queen b3. White just simply doesn't have to play queen e4. So something to look at there. Just because a move is forcing and you see one line that's good for you, doesn't mean you necessarily should go for it. Now, I don't think queen d2 by any means wins the game, because of course this pawn is defended twice, and we can simply move the knight back to g6 again. And here our opponent's probably just going to move the rook. But just wanted to highlight that all these games, all tournament games, are going to be full of these tiny little decisions that can very drastically change the outcome of the game. So be on the lookout for these things in your games, and make sure you're thinking all the way through. Just because you see one line that kind of looks tricky doesn't mean you should necessarily go for it. So the move I actually played in the game, because again, opponent's rated 1,400 FIDE, I played rook e to d8. So keeping pieces on the board still, and maybe now I'm thinking about bringing this knight to f4, now that my rook is not going to be traded if I play this knight to g6, for example. My opponent plays the move g3, stopping any ideas of knight f4 kind of forever. So after this, I take back over my e5 square with knight g6, get rook e4, and I put this queen opposite these pieces on b7. My opponent plays rook a to e1. I go knight f6. It's time to, start kicking these rooks around. Can't let them stay there forever. My opponent plays rook back to e2. And now I continue through with a4. So, I've kind of got my positional space advantage on the queen side, right? And I'm reasonably happy about that. But again, it's nothing too special. In the meantime, my opponent isn't exactly out of constructive things to do. White has entirely taken over the e file. And the next step is to find an invasion square. So at the moment, my knights are doing a great job of covering all the invasion squares. So what do you think White does to make a square for their rooks? And keep in mind, when you're thinking of yourself as the player with white pieces, remember you're 10 years old. You, in the meantime, are trying to think about whether or not you're going to get a juice box after the game. You have to remember how to tie your shoes. You don't know how to sign your name yet, so just keep in mind you're dealing with all of this and also trying to come up with a chess move. And yeah, you guys are entirely right here. White should play this knight f to e5. Of course, the c knight is too important to move, so we move the f knight. Now again, there's a saying in chess where you should never be the one to break the tension, because whenever you capture something, very often you draw your opponent's pieces into the game, and I think that's the case here. So rather than capture, I left the knights in tension and actually played this move, rook a to b8. Correctly noticing that after knight a5, we are not losing the game to some knight c6 tactic, because we can simply take on e5 first, hitting our opponent's queen and rook. If our opponent were to capture, we capture back, and I think we are actually winning in that line. So rook a b8, and my opponent, understanding that he's 1400 FIDE, captures on g6. So I take back, and rook e7, rook d7, no reason to let this rook stay on the 7th rank, and we actually get a trade, and I take back with the knight. And I don't take back with the queen here, even though this may look slightly tempting, because after rook e5, I really can't be getting away with queen h3. My opponent's simply going to kick me out with queen f1, and I haven't made any progress. So instead, I take back with the knight, the reason being, again, King Zlatan's idea from so long ago, we need to kick this knight off of c4 to make inroads on the queen side. It's really the only winning idea I could find in the position for black. In the meantime, though, our opponent is not just sitting back, letting us do it. Benjamin played queen e4, I go queen a6, and he just steps back to queen d3, repeating the position. Of course, I'm not so interested in a draw, so we finally get our move, knight to b6. We had our little scuffle over the e file, and now I get to go knight b6, kicking the knight away. Unfortunately for me, Benjamin, I think, had thought of this and played this move, knight to e5. So what do you think here, chat? What should black play? Keeping in mind, again, we are trying to win the game. Trying very hard to win the game, in fact. What should we do in response to knight e5? This is the tough decision I was faced with in the game. Mike thinks I'm implying that we shouldn't take on d3. I don't know. I don't know. SNJ says queen a5. Okay. Charles says queen a5. Everybody says queen a5. So the correct move here is queen takes d3. So why is the correct move queen takes d3? Because you shouldn't try to overpress in your chess games. Now, that being said, sometimes I'm wrong. So I didn't take on d3 in the game, but it turns out every other move leaves black pretty significantly worse. And that is often how lower rated players end up winning against their higher rated counterparts. They have the benefit of being able to play simply, rely on the threat of a draw to force their opponent to make concessions. And the reason why they do it is because it works. So in this case, Queen takes d3 is really not going to give you anything besides a draw. We can see knight takes d3, for example. If I go knight c4, trying to break in, this is not going to get us very far at all. Not going to get us very far at all. For example, rook d1 here. Take, 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 take. And good luck winning this position against anybody, honestly. Like, literally anybody. Good luck winning this position. So queen takes d3 pretty much kills the game. I can play like rook c8 here and try to keep some things in tension, but it's going to be very, very difficult to win the game after this particular queen trade. So I played the move queen c8, trying to play on. The problem with queen a5, I think, by the way, is that after something like rook e4, you have to be very, very careful what you do because, well, first of all, this is a fork, and second of all, there are some pretty scary threats coming your way. For example, knight takes f7 actually does leave white with a better position in this case. So got to be pretty careful about what you're doing here. I played queen c8 though, and what I expected to happen was my opponent was going to play queen b5, I was going to play knight d5, they were going to take a4, I was going to take b2, and I was going to be slightly worse. But who can tell me what I missed when I played queen c8? What did I miss? The problem with c4 there is that I think the knight comes to b4, chess pro, and then rook d1, and your d pawn is weak. Good question, though. Should have mentioned that. So what did I miss here? What's white's big idea? Thank you, Caesar. Thank you for the congrats. All right, we've got a lot of games to get to, so no time left to think. Go ahead and pause now if you want to try to figure it out. But of course, queen b5 is actually the correct move to start with. The big trick I played on you guys is that white isn't actually necessarily taking this pawn on a4, because queen c4 is actually a much nastier idea. Now this knight is attacked, this pawn is attacked. It's actually impossible to defend both of them. So I would have to bail out with some queen b7 move, go rook c8, lose this pawn, rook takes d2. But here, of course, white is just significantly better. Black is only playing for a draw. You know, perhaps even simplest is white just taking this pawn off the board at the first available opportunity. And I'm going to be suffering in this game. Fortunately for me, though, my opponent didn't see it. And this is another psychological thing that you guys can work on in your games. One of the toughest thing to do, and this is actually something that happens even at the highest levels of chess, is switch your mindset in the game. So pretty clearly, my opponent's mindset in this game was, I'm looking to draw this guy, this old man I'm playing. I'm looking to draw him so I can get back to my goldfish crackers and watching SpongeBob. And so it's tough to switch from that mindset to the mindset of, oh, maybe I can win this game. So because I think my opponent was in the wrong mindset, he was still just trying to draw. I think he wasn't entirely looking for opportunities to sort of turn the tables. So that's something to be vigilant for, because even at the top level, people do struggle with this switching mindsets. So my opponent instead played queen f3, still attacking f7, but just not in the correct way. I did actually see this one, and I played queen e6, which is perfectly fine now. My opponent goes queen c6, trying to trade the queens. I tried to trick my opponent with rook to e8, hoping for queen takes c5, when knight d7, while being slightly complicated, is in fact winning a piece, and black should be better. Instead, though, my clever 10-year-old opponent plays queen b5, so not falling for the trick, and now I must defend my c-pawn. So I go rook c8, we get knight d3, and now white is actually making some very real threats to my back rank, so I had to trade the queens after all. So why spend so much time on those moves where, you know, I missed this queen b5 idea, played queen c8, and then ended up here? So why spend so much time there? Well, if you notice, if I had just traded the queens way back here, rather than playing queen c8, if I had just taken here, it's almost an identical position, right? My rook was on c8, I think, in the actual, or c6 in the actual game. And in fact, I would rather have my rook on b8 than c6 because now there's a potential check for my opponent. So what did all my overpressing get me? Literally nothing. It got me a worse position than if I had just traded queens in the first place. So that's the thing I wanted to let you guys know. While it can be very, very tempting to overpress, you should really just be taking your chances where you find them, creating as many tricky positions as possible, but you definitely don't want to be sacrificing your position for those chances. That being said, the great news for me is that my opponent is still 10 years old. He did not have a birthday during the game, and that means he's probably not going to be very good at endgames. It's just how kids are. I don't know what it is. They just don't understand endgames. So still decent chances. My opponent plays king f1, which is strange because rook e8 check definitely should have been played. It drives my king away from the center of the board. Now that my opponent didn't play it, I continued with king f8. Now we see rook e5, and I push the pawn out to c4, which is still a little bit risky, but I thought the position was still fine. We get knight b4, rook d6, and now after king e2, I push the rook away. My opponent picks the b5 square, and we end up in some kind of balance here. All my pawns are defended. This knight is actually a little bit stuck, but neither of us can really make any progress without risking a lot. So I played the obvious moves. I just brought my king into the game. My opponent played f4 to take control of these squares, continued bringing my king in, and my opponent played king to d2. So now, how can we create some chances for black? Where could we possibly break through in this game? What do we think, chat room? Zaire asked, did I see this queen b5, queen c4 idea over the board or an analysis? I actually did see it over the board, but my opponent moved reasonably quickly, so I didn't, fortunately, I didn't have too much time to panic about it. Fortunately, I didn't have too much time to panic. Kings Latan says, how did you win this? That's my question for you. How did I win this? Can you come up with a winning plan here? So it's a little bit unfair to be presenting this in a lecture because in reality, I calculated for 20 plus minutes here before deciding on my move. And that's about how much time you should spend if you're going to play the move that I played. So what I did is, in fact, Mr. Monster's move, c3. And I actually calculated a very long line that actually happens in the game. So the idea of this move is basically I am sacrificing a pawn more or less in order to bring the king away from the center and start going after the king's side. That was the only idea I could see in the game to try and win, and so that's what I went for. I decided it didn't look too risky, and it ended up working out. So let's see the specifics. We get b takes c3, knight c4 check, king d3. I repeated moves once, and then took on a3. And so this is my idea. I'm going to take a3, then after rook a5, I'm going to take c3, and I am in fact losing this a4 pawn, but in return, I get to play this check. My opponent is coming to b2 now to stop ideas like a3, and I get my knight over here. So what's the point? Well, the helpful arrows on your screen will hopefully show you the point. The point is I gave my opponent this c pawn, but in return, I drew this rook off the 5th rank, allowing my king access to the king side, and I have ideas such as knight f1 as well to fork these pawns on the king side. And in my perfect world, I'm going to win all the pawns on the king side before my opponent can queen the c pawn, and then I will potentially sacrifice for the c pawn and win the game. Ambitious, I know, but that's what we went for. So in the game, I realized that this knight is actually doing a nice job of keeping c4 from happening in the immediate future, so I decided to bring my king in, also preventing ideas like rook a6, ideas like rook a5. My opponent plays knight d3, which I think is already sort of strange. I thought my opponent was going to play something like h3, try his best to keep my king out, and maybe even go after my own pawns in the meantime. And I think this would have been a great way to kind of kill the game. But at this point, I think my opponent saw his passed pawn and perhaps got a little bit excited and wanted to try to win. So opponent played knight d3. I played knight f1, attacking two things at the same time. get rook a3, knight h2, and now c4. So this was the point of rook a3. It also helps defend the pawn on g3. I play knight f1 again. I want more pawns. Opponent plays c5, rook c6, rook c3. And of course, because my opponent's 10 years old, he calculates everything correctly. So knight takes g3. The idea was knight b4, and it's nothing more than a draw there. I have to retreat. I lose my knight. White loses all the pawns, and we can go home. So because I'm still trying to win, I played rook c8, stepping out of this threat. And now, if my opponent was happy with the draw, I think he would have played this move knight b4, allowing me to take, and take. But I think, unfortunately, I succeeded in making my opponent think he had good chances to win the game. So my opponent tried to keep his c-pawn, played this move c6, giving me this g3 pawn. But now after c7, it's really only black that can win. I simply bring this knight back into the game, rook c2, and now I play knight d6. And white now actually only has one move to keep the balance. Every other move is just dead lost for white, but there's one idea to hold the draw. So you can pause the video if you want to find it. I still don't fully understand all the details on how it works. It's just kind of an engine line that draws. So if you want to try to find that, go ahead. If not, the move, of course, is rook c5 check. The idea being that after king e4, we get knight b4. If I take this guy, you get knight d5 check. And somehow, some way, white is just in time to draw the game with the idea of winning my piece here, and then bringing the knight back, successfully, magically sacrificing for the pawns and drawing. So still not easy by any means for white, but that was the only idea. Instead, white played knight b4. Now I simply go knight e8, and white doesn't ever have time to do anything because white's going to have to defend the c-pawn the whole time. Knight a6, king f4, and the rest is very easy. The pawn goes up the board, and the game ends. Check, check. I took the pawn on c7, and white resigned. So I think this might have been the hardest game of the tournament for me, just because it lasted forever. It's 66 moves long, and already it was only in round 2. That being said, we've only got about 13 minutes left, so I'm going to skip ahead in the tournament. We're going to skip rounds 3 and 4. Maybe those will show up in a later lecture, maybe not. But I want to take you now to round 5 against the terrifying Sergei Muratov. So fun fact about Sergei, he played the first round. I took a half-point bye in the first round. And in round 6 of the tournament, my 5th game, but it was round 6, this guy had 5.5 points. He won his first 5 games just outright, won his first 4 games outright, drew his 5th game, and then he had me in round 6. So terrifying guy, right? So I'm a little bit afraid. So I play d4, my normal stuff. I did some research before. Turns out this guy is always playing like these weird half Benoni systems where you go knight f6, c5, and d6, fianchetto the bishop, but then wait to play e6 until later. And so imagine my surprise when he plays 1d5. Whatever, that's fine. That's why I don't put too much emphasis on prepping for your opponent beforehand. A lot of the times you just get surprised anyways. So d5, we just play normal stuff. c4, e6, knight c3. And Sergei comes out with the triangle. By the way, Sergei's an FM. FM Sergei Muratov, by the way. No joke. So he plays the triangle, and I'm like, okay, I've done some work on this line. I play the Marshall Gambit. My opponent decides to accept. We get take, check, bishop d2, queen takes d4. This is all just theory. The idea of this line is that white sacrifices this d4 pawn for a little bit of development, and black gives up this bishop for this knight on e4, bringing the queen into the game. Now, the main move is bishop e2, but I chose to play knight e2 instead. My opponent quickly played knight a6, and I played the best move of all time. This is why I play this opening line, just because this move is so cool. Of course, that move is bishop f8, attacking the g7 pawn. What are you going to do about it? The point being, of course, king takes f8 is met with checkmate. So this bishop is untouchable. My opponent plays the best move, knight e5, But I noticed that he actually spent a few minutes thinking about knight e5 before he played it, or knight e7 before he played it, which I found to be very, very strange because it's, it's technically not the only move, but it's kind of the only move in the position. So why is my opponent thinking here? And then I took on g7. He quickly played rook g8. I played bishop f6 very, very quickly. And again, we have another victim of the not thinking in the opening trap. Just because it's the opening doesn't mean you can't play too quickly. And to his credit, my opponent did spend some time here. I think he took about 5 minutes on this move after bishop f6. And then he played a move that blunders. So, what is white's threat here? What is white's threat? And Justin is asking, I guess in the past, what time the Tuesday lectures are. So, Justin, when you catch up to me here, 6:30 p.m. Central Time every Tuesday. Same time, same place. Kings Latan says, this line is a draw. There's some crazy knight b4 stuff. I think there's a way to play on for both sides in the draw line, but the main line is a draw, yeah. So, of course, the threat I'm making that my opponent missed is to play queen d6, and after e5, the game actually ended. Queen d6 is checkmate in 2, and the big bad, what I thought was going to be boss of the tournament, Sergei Muratov, who had 4.5 out of 5, hadn't lost a game, beat his first 4 opponents soundly, hung checkmate on move 11. So crazy stuff there. Definitely didn't expect it. This was, I think, literally the easiest game of my life in over-the-board chess. And yeah, you know what? It just goes to show sometimes it's nice to be lucky. So what should he have done instead? Well, of course, against this line, there are a few things you can do. I think simplest is just to go rook g6 when we're going to transpose to one of the main lines. White has to go queen d4. We trade the queens. We get c5, bishop c3, knight b4. And the position is more or less equal here. But opponent played e5, and that was the end of the game. So lucky for me, got a quick win in the morning, and then that set me up to do well in the final round. The puzzler asks, how's an FM below 2300 USCF? I don't think he has played very many USCF tournaments at all. I think he's around 2200 something FIDE as well. So I think they might have taken the FIDE rating at some tournament and went from there. But very quickly, I want to speed through the last round of the tournament. This is the one that secured clear first place for me. Going into this round, I was a half point ahead of the field. There were 3 people trying to catch me. I was playing one of them, named Max Zinski, and the other 2 players were playing on the board lower than me. So I kind of did some prep for Max. I looked at what he played in the past. He has a pretty public chess.com profile, so I looked on there, tried to prep against him. But he ended up surprising me. So again, goes to show you how useful prep is. I also get the feeling that Sergei Muratov might have tried to prep against me. Maybe he found some games, something I had shown in this Marshall Gambit line and thought he could trick me there. But in my experience, if you prep something you don't normally play, just doesn't really work out for you. Didn't work out for Sergei, didn't really work out for Evan, and we'll see it doesn't really work out for Max here either. So Max plays e4, c6, knight c3, d5, knight f3, and we get a 2 knights Caro. Now, I knew that Max played this, and I was expecting this. I played my normal line with knight f6. I've been considering switching from this line because there are some dubious ideas where white might be able to get an advantage, but I felt the most comfortable. So I stuck with what I knew, taking my own advice. We get e5, knight e4, and now my opponent surprises me with knight takes e4. This has been played 17 times in the Lead Chess database, as opposed to the other ideas which have been played hundreds of times. So knight takes e4 was the big surprise Max had in his prep for me. So I took back. We get knight g5. I go queen d5, and this is why this move is sort of rare. You are just losing this pawn on e5. Nothing you can really do about it. But my opponent had planned for this and played d4, and we see now the point of white's play is to sacrifice a pawn. So here we are. My opponent has 3 pieces developed. I have 0 pieces developed. How should we try to continue the game? I had no experience in this position, had never seen it before in my life going into this game. So this one was definitely a bit nerve-wracking. It's the final round. Likely all I need is a draw to at least, well, definitely at least tie for first with a draw, or maybe even get clear first. And my opponent is, playing this garbage, sacrificing all his center pawns and trying to checkmate me. So how do we do it? What are our priorities here as the black player? Merrick says compensation. Yeah, definitely white has a ton of compensation here. No arguing that. Why not queen takes b2? Yeah, you guys are psycho, okay? Literally insane. Did you hear me? You are winning the Chicago Open U2300 section. All you need is a draw to get out of this place with the first place title and check, by the way. And you guys want to move the queen again and play queen takes b2. Just, I can't believe it. So this is actually a bit too much for black here. You can't play this move as well. White's just going to castle. You now have to extract your queen again, and you are losing a little bit too much time. So queen takes b2 isn't going to do it. Of course, your only priority here as black is to find a way to develop your pieces, castle your king, and survive the opening. So it turns out the most popular move here is h6, for good reason, as we'll see later. But in the game, I chose just to develop instead with knight d7. I don't think my opponent had seen this move before in his prep, so already we're back on level footing. My opponent is out of his prep, and so am I. So he comes up with queen e2. I play knight f6. This was the idea, just bringing the pieces into the game. And now my opponent hits me with f4. And this is when I start kind of regretting not kicking this knight away. So, of course, what's my opponent's idea? Well, he wants to break things open on the e-file with f5. I wasn't quite sure the best way to continue here. It turns out, in this case, maybe you can take on b2, but I chose the simpler queen a5 check, bishop d2, and queen c5, trying to keep my opponent's king from castling on the king side, also trying to keep an eye on this f5 square, threatening to find a way to develop. Again, now that I've taken all of the center pawns, I'm up a clean pawn. My goal is not to threaten, too much material. My goal is just to get the pieces into the game and complete development. So I go queen c5, and my opponent plays bishop c4. I have to go e6, and now I realize I'm in a little bit of trouble here. Because I didn't kick this knight away earlier on in the opening, my opponent's attacking ideas become very, very strong against this e6 pawn here. f5 is going to be difficult to stop, and things could go badly. That being said, black definitely isn't out of it yet. I do have this extra pawn, and that's sort of my saving grace here. So white castles queenside. I develop with bishop e7, and we get a very strange move by white, a3. So this gives away pretty much, I think, all of the advantage for white here. a3 is one of those moves that kind of has an idea, like my opponent's idea is to play bishop b4 at some moment, but it's just way too slow and kind of besides the point in this position. I was worried more about moves like rook f1, preparing f5, f5 directly, rook e1, g4, for example. Any move that advances the plan against the e-pawn is really what my opponent should have been playing for. Rather than this sort of irrelevant move a3, when you sacrifice a pawn, especially a center pawn, you need to play actively and quickly. And my opponent didn't do that. Instead, played with a3. And because of that, I was able to consolidate a lot with this move, knight d5. My opponent sensed that the attack was fading, so he played f5. But now I get to simplify with bishop takes g5, takes, and castle. So I've castled, haven't even lost my extra pawn, and as such, I think black doesn't have too much to be worried about here. White captures on d5, I capture back, threatening this guy. And it turns out my opponent does have sort of one last idea to keep the dynamic balance in the game with this move bishop e7. I was planning rook e8, but after rook e1, I do have to move the queen c4 for example, and my opponent's going to step out of it, keep the queens on the board, and the game's going to stay interesting. Instead, though, my opponent tried f6, and now from here I managed to take over the game. Bishop f5 comes out. Of course, I'm not interested in playing g6 or taking on f6. This is going to make my king a little bit unnecessarily weak, simply bishop f5, and if my opponent ever plays fg7, I'm happy to step to the e file and temporarily use this pawn to help defend my king. So bishop f5 was played in the game. My opponent came up with rook h to e1, but unfortunately this allows black to sort of take the advantage. So black to move here and seize the initiative. We've been playing defensively for so long, it's finally time to start going on the attack. What can we do? All right, and I'm noticing now that I'm running a bit out of time. So if you do want to find it for yourself, go ahead and pause the video, but I'm just going to show my idea. There are a lot of different moves you can play here. You can try and get on the e file with rook a8. Note that queen e8 is met with queen c2 mate, not recapturing. But I chose d4 in the game, and I think this is a pretty nice idea to press the position. The threat is going to be d3 now. By the way, we're also threatening bishop takes c2 and this bishop on g5, and all of the weak spots in white's position start to kind of come under fire at once here. My opponent tried f takes g7, but now I can simply step to e8. I'm no longer back rank mated because my opponent captured on g7. We get takes, 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 and takes. My opponent plays rook d2, and unfortunately for me, the game isn't over. Black definitely has a pretty sizable advantage here, but there's not really a knockout blow. You would think bishop c2 would be working, but it turns out there's this annoying bishop e7, even bishop f8 check idea to follow, and so there's no knockout punch here. And since we're running out of time, I'm going to kind of zoom through the rest of the game. It lasted forever, but the last point I want to make on a practical note is that my opponent prepped for me, played a line he wasn't comfortable with, and now has a slightly worse position. But worse than all of that is he has 2 minutes on the clock. And that's the worst thing that you can do in your tournament games. If you play something you're not comfortable with, you're going to go down on time, and then when you really need the time, you're not going to be able to have it. So my opponent, to his credit, held on for a long time. We pushed the game for a long, long time. Pawns came off the board. Eventually, we get this position. My opponent plays bishop a7, sensing that h3, h2 is coming. And I come up with a nice tactic here, although I'm also starting to run out of time. We start with queen e5. My opponent plays rook h1, knowing that the threat is h3, h2. And here, black actually has a winning move. In the game, for whatever reason, I saw the tactic on the following move. I actually calculated this ahead of time. I saw it on the next move, but didn't realize I could play it here. So of course, black to move, the winning idea is we get to snap off this c2 pawn. Very thematic with the rooks disconnected to look for checks that fork the king and the rook. Now in my head, I only saw check and check to fork the king and the rook. So I wasted a tempo, let my opponent take, and then took on c2. So now, of course, if takes, I go check, check, and pick up the rook. The game continued, though, now with bishop d4. I attack the rook. We get rook h1, queen d5 now. Attacks these pieces. We get check, bishop back to g6, and bishop e3. And now the game, once again, is going to continue for a long time. But my opponent at this point is playing on the increment. And things get a little dicey for my king. But at the end of the day, I managed to push these pawns on the queen side, pick up this b pawn, and at this point, white is entirely busted. Bring the king up, and finally here, in the time pressure, my opponent blunders. So at this point, white is already dead lost. King f3 is a devastating threat. My opponent tried bishop f4, but I simply capture, and I actually got checkmate on the board, thus ending my run at the 2021 Chicago Open. So as I speak, Varakobian is in the room with me here. He's going to get set up, and he's going to be directly following this lecture with another excellent lecture. Hopefully you guys enjoyed my games from the Chicago Open, found something in it to be instructive. I had a lot of fun, obviously, at the tournament, and I hope I can share more successful tournaments with you guys in the future. Let me know what you think in the comments. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.